Imagine standing on a Greek hillside sometime in the 5th century BC, watching a Persian fleet materialize out of the Aegean haze. You have no radio, no telegraph, no way to shout across 50 miles of open water, but somewhere behind you, on the highest point of land for miles around, a stack of wood and pitch is waiting. You light it, miles away. Another watcher sees your fire and lights their own. Within minutes, a warning is racing across the coastline, faster than any ship could sail it. That image sits at the heart of one of antiquity's most underappreciated achievements, a signal network that some historians argue could push information across 50 miles of open ocean, using nothing more than fire, height, and human ingenuity. And yet the closer you examine it, the more complicated the picture becomes. Were these simply alarm fires, useful for saying danger is coming and nothing else? Or did the Greeks eventually build something closer to a true communication system, capable of transmitting specific, structured messages across hundreds of miles of sea and mountain? This video is going to work through that question carefully, because the answer involves at least 4 distinct stories that all need to fit together. The first is geography, the physical landscape of the Greek world, with its chains of islands and high coastal ridges, was almost purpose-built for line-of-sight signaling, and understanding why towers were typically spaced around 20 miles apart tells you a great deal about what the system's designers were actually trying to solve. The second story is crisis. We have real historical accounts, from Herodotus and Thucydides, of beacons being used in genuine naval emergencies, fires lit at Sciathus to warn Greek forces of the approaching Persian fleet, and signals raised at Corcyra to announce the arrival of 60 Athenian ships. These are not myths. They are documented moments where fire on a hilltop changed the course of events at sea. The third story is the one that gets genuinely surprising, the move from simple alarm fires towards something that could carry actual coded messages. By the 2nd century BC, Greek engineers named Cleoxenes and Demokletos had developed a system called the pyrseia, a torch and alphabet arrangement that used 2 groups of 5 torches, one representing a row and one a column, to pinpoint any letter of the Greek alphabet. That is not a warning system, that is telecommunications. And the fact that it existed at all forces us to ask when the transition from fire as alarm to fire as language actually began, and how much of that capacity ever reached the open sea. The fourth story is modern science catching up with ancient practice. Recent GIS-based visibility modelling has tried to calculate how far a bonfire on a 40-metre tower could actually be seen under real atmospheric conditions. The results come in at roughly 32 kilometres under clear skies for a typical coastal height, but the 50-mile figure you may have heard attached to this system is not just hype. It represents what becomes possible when geography cooperates fully, when you place your fire on a genuinely high hilltop and conditions are ideal. It is an upper bound, not a guaranteed performance, and that distinction matters enormously for how we interpret the ancient evidence. Which brings us to the tension that runs through this entire topic, the gap between what the system theoretically could do and what we can actually prove it did. The ancient texts are selective. Some authors, including Polybius, are explicit that early beacon networks could convey only a handful of prearranged signals, essentially different meanings assigned to fire present or fire absent, or perhaps variations in the number and position of torches. The fully alphabetic pyrseia may have remained more of an engineering proposal than a widely deployed operational system. We will be honest about where the evidence is solid and where it trails off into inference, because one of the things that makes this subject so interesting is precisely the boundary between what we know and what we are still trying to reconstruct. What we can say with confidence is that the Greeks built and used a network of signal stations, called phryctoria, that represented something genuinely new in the ancient world, a deliberate infrastructure for long-distance communication, engineered around topography, tested under the pressure of naval warfare, and sophisticated enough that later civilizations, including the Byzantines 9 centuries on, were still refining and extending the same basic concept with stations sometimes 60. miles apart. By the end of this video, you will understand how the system actually worked in physical terms, why the Aegean geography made it possible, what those two classical naval moments reveal about its real-world capabilities, how the coded torch system operated mechanically, and where modern calculations either support or complicate the headline claim about 50 miles. You will also come away with a clearer sense of what those fires really meant, not just as military tools, but as evidence of something remarkable about how ancient people understood the problem of distance and what they were willing to build to solve it. To understand what made the phryctoria remarkable, you first have to appreciate how genuinely difficult communication was in the ancient Mediterranean world, not just technically, but structurally. The problem was not simply that people lacked good tools. It was that the environment created challenges which no amount of human effort on foot or horseback could fully overcome, and the sea made everything worse. Think about what a fleet commander in the 5th century BC was actually dealing with. His ships could move at speeds that land messengers struggled to match over short distances, but they were completely blind to anything beyond the visible horizon. Once a fleet left port, it entered a kind of informational void. The admiral knew what was happening where he was, he knew nothing about what was happening 50 miles away. And 50 miles, in the Aegean, was not an unusual distance between strategically critical points. It was Tuesday. The islands were everywhere, the sea lanes were narrow and contested, and the difference between a Persian fleet rounding a headland on a Thursday morning and a Greek fleet learning about it on Thursday evening could determine whether a city survived or burned. There was no lighthouse of Alexandria to guide ships towards safe harbour. That structure would not be built until the 3rd century BC, somewhere between 284 and 246 BC. And even then it was designed primarily as a navigational aid, not a communication device. Before it existed, the Mediterranean coastline after dark was largely unlit, and the fragmented archipelago of the Greek world presented not just physical obstacles, but informational ones. Every island chain was a series of blind corners. Every headland hid what lay behind it. Commanders had to make decisions at a distance based on information that was always hours old by the time it arrived, carried by a rower or a runner who had seen something, and then travelled as fast as his body could manage. The natural response to this kind of problem, developed independently across many cultures and long before anyone thought of it as a formal system, was elevation and fire. These two things in combination solved the most fundamental limitation of human-scale communication, the curvature of the earth and the physical obstacles between people. A man standing on flat ground can see perhaps 3 miles before the horizon cuts his view. Put him on a ridge 200 meters high, and that horizon expands dramatically. Give him a fire visible at night or in certain daytime conditions, and you have extended the reach of a single human observer by an order of magnitude. This was not a technological breakthrough in the modern sense. It was the application of observation and common sense to a very old problem. What matters about the Greek world specifically is that it was saturated with exactly the right geography for turning this intuition into a network. The Aegean is not an open ocean in the way the Atlantic or the Pacific is. It is a fragmented, mountainous, deeply indented environment where islands are rarely far from other islands, where coastal ridges often run in chains that face each other across short stretches of water, and where a single well-placed peak can command sightlines in multiple directions simultaneously. The mountains are steep enough to provide dramatically elevated platforms, but not so massive that they are inaccessible or remote from the coastline they overlook. The islands function almost like stepping stones, each one a potential relay point. If you were designing a landscape for optical telegraphy, you would design something that looked very much like the Aegean. This was not lost on the Greeks. Their maritime culture made them acutely sensitive to the relationship between terrain and visibility. They were a civilization that navigated by landmarks, that built temples on high promontories, partly because height was culturally and practically significant, and that organized their military thinking around the control of key passes, straits and headlands. The instinct to use high ground for observation was already deeply embedded in how they understood space and strategy. The transition from using high ground to watch the sea to using high ground to signal across it was short, conceptually, if not always chronologically. Fire itself carried deep significance in Greek culture long before anyone systematized its use for communication. The Iliad, composed in something close to its surviving form in the 8th century BC, already uses fire on a hilltop as an image of alarm and warning. Achilles raises a signal fire in Book 18. These literary appearances reflect an assumption that audiences would immediately understand that fire on an elevated point meant danger, or news, or both. You did not need to explain to a Greek audience what a fire on a hilltop was for. The meaning was intuitive enough to survive as metaphor and simile in poetry, which tells you something important. This was not an exotic or specialized practice. It was a recognized feature of the world these people inhabited. But there is a crucial difference between cultural familiarity with fire as signal and the deliberate engineering of a relay network. The former requires nothing more than a hillside and a terrified watcher. The latter requires pre-arrangement, agreement on meaning, maintenance of watching stations, and enough trust in the system that commanders will actually act on what a distant fire tells them, rather than waiting for a messenger to confirm it. That gap between instinctive use and systematic infrastructure is where the phryctoria begins to become interesting as a historical phenomenon. The pressure that pushed people across that gap was almost entirely military and maritime. You do not build a network of relay stations, each position to be visible from the next at roughly 20 miles spacing, because you are idly curious about whether fire can be seen from a great distance. You build it because you have faced or genuinely fear a situation in which a hostile fleet can close the distance between sighting and arrival faster than any mounted rider. The sea made this threat visceral. A fleet under sail or oar could cover 20 miles in a few hours under good conditions. The same 20 miles overland across rocky terrain with unreliable roads could take considerably longer. The asymmetry between maritime speed and land communication speed was one of the defining strategic anxieties of the ancient Mediterranean world, and fire on high ground was one of the very few things that could resolve it. The Greeks were not alone in using fire signals. Other ancient cultures used them too, but several features of their situation made them particularly likely to develop the practice into something more systematic. The first was the sheer density of contested space in the Aegean. The number of city-states, alliances, rivalries, and overlapping maritime interests in a relatively small geographic area created constant pressure to communicate faster than your enemies could move. The second was the existence of a community of engineers, strategists, and writers who thought carefully about military problems and recorded their thinking. Whatever operational knowledge accumulated about beacon systems was not entirely lost to time, because Greek intellectual culture had a habit of examining and documenting the mechanisms behind practical achievements. This is partly why we know as much as we do. The third factor was the specific character of the Persian threat, which arrived suddenly and at scale. When Herodotus describes beacons being lit at Sciathus to warn the Greek fleet gathering at Artemisium that the Persian navy was approaching, he is describing a moment that crystallized exactly the problem fire signaling was meant to solve. A Persian fleet of extraordinary size was moving along the northern Aegean coast. The Greek defenders needed to know where it was before it arrived. A watching station on the island of Sciathus, positioned precisely because it commanded a wide view of the northern approaches, was the mechanism through which that knowledge could travel faster than the ships themselves. The system did not emerge from abstract planning. It emerged because the alternative was being caught without warning. That same urgency applies to the later account in Thucydides, where beacon signals at Corcyra communicate the approach of 60 Athenian ships at night. In both cases, what is striking is not the theoretical capability of the technology, but the operational assumption behind it, that the beacon system would work reliably enough that commanders would stake real decisions on its outputs. You do not prepare your harbour and your forces on the basis of a fire you saw in the distance, unless you have some confidence in what that fire means and where it came from. That confidence does not come from a single improvised bonfire. It comes from a network that has been built, staffed, and maintained for exactly this purpose. So the world before formal long-distance telegraphy was not a world without long-distance communication. It was a world where communication was slow, unreliable, and almost entirely dependent on physical messengers who moved no faster than the animals carrying them. Into that world, the beacon system inserted something genuinely different, a channel where information travelled at the speed of light, or close enough to matter, rather than the speed of a horse. The infrastructure behind that channel, the towers and the watchers, and the pre-arranged meanings and the relay distances, was what turned an ancient instinct about fire and height into something that deserves to be taken seriously as an early form of telecommunications. And it was the Greek landscape, with its mountains, its islands, and its centuries of maritime urgency, that provided both the raw materials and the relentless incentive to build it. None of this could have existed without the right terrain. The phryctoria was not simply a clever idea that could have been deployed anywhere. It was a technology that the Greek landscape essentially made inevitable. The geography of the Aegean did not just accommodate the beacon network. It actively shaped it, constrained it, and in many ways created the conditions under which it became viable at all. To understand why the system worked, you have to spend some time understanding the world it was built inside. Start with the basic physical character of Greece itself. This is one of the most mountainous countries in Europe, with ridgelines that drop sharply into the sea, peninsulas that jut out into the water like natural watchtowers, and a coastline so deeply indented that the straight-line distance between 2 points routinely understates the actual geographic complexity between them. The mountains are not gentle, rolling hills. They are steep, rocky, and in many places they rise directly from the shoreline with very little transition. That severity, which made overland travel genuinely difficult and road building an enormous challenge, turned out to be precisely the quality that made optical communication practical. The same terrain that slowed a messenger on horseback offered, from its heights, unobstructed views across dozens of miles of open water. Then add the islands. The Aegean is not an open sea. It is a scattered archipelago, with somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 islands depending on how you count, ranging from major land masses to exposed rocky outcroppings barely large enough to support a watchtower and the people needed to staff it. These islands are not randomly distributed. They tend to form chains and clusters, with individual islands often positioned at intervals that, from the right elevated point, put the next island well within visual range. Ancient engineers did not have to invent this geometry. They inherited it from the geology of a drowned mountain range, the remnant of a landscape that had been submerged by the Mediterranean over geological time, leaving only the peaks above water as islands. What looks like a navigational environment from sea level looks, from the right hilltop, like a series of natural relay stations. This is the fundamental insight behind the phryctoria's design. The system did not work by lighting one enormous fire and hoping it could be seen across hundreds of miles of ocean. No fire burns that brightly, and no human eye could resolve it at that distance, even if it did. Instead, the network operated as a chain, each station visible to the next, each fire watched by the next station along the line, each observation triggering another lighting, passing the signal forward like a relay runner handing off a torch. The message did not travel a great distance in a single leap. It travelled in a series of short hops, each one modest enough to be physically reliable, the cumulative effect of which was that information could cross the entire Aegean in the time it would have taken a messenger to cover a fraction of that distance. The typical spacing between stations in this chain was about 20 miles, roughly 30 kilometres in modern terms. That number was not arbitrary. It was determined by the limits of human vision under realistic atmospheric conditions and the practical question of how high a beacon fire could be placed. Modern visibility modelling, using the kind of terrain analysis that was not available to ancient engineers, but that confirms their practical judgment, shows that a fire on a tower approximately 40 metres above sea level can be spotted at somewhere between 30 and 35 kilometres under clear conditions. Put that fire on a genuine mountain summit rather than a modest tower, and the line of sight can extend to 50 kilometres or beyond. The 20-mile spacing essentially fell out of those physical constraints. It was close enough that a well-maintained fire on a known high point could reliably be seen from the next station in the chain, while being far enough apart that the network covered meaningful distances without requiring an unreasonable number of stations. What this means in practice is that the landscape performed much of the engineering work. Ancient builders did not need to calculate optimal tower heights from first principles or conduct systematic visibility surveys in the modern sense. They could rely on the accumulated knowledge of sailors and soldiers who had spent generations reading this coastline. The fisherman who knew which hilltop gave you the best view of the northern approaches, the garrison commander who could see 3 islands from his fort on a clear morning, the harbour pilot who could identify individual headlands at distances that astonished visitors from inland regions. These people carried in their heads the intervisibility data that made the network possible. The towers were placed on high points because experience, confirmed by observation, showed those high points commanded the widest views. The Aegean was particularly well suited to this approach in a way that the Mediterranean as a whole was not. The Western Mediterranean, with its longer distances between major islands and its more open sea lanes, would have required different spacing and different infrastructure to achieve the same effect. But in the Aegean, the islands themselves were close enough, and the Greek mainland's mountain ridges were high enough and oriented correctly enough toward the sea, that a chain of relay stations could be threaded through the landscape almost continuously. You could in principle construct a line of sight from the northern approaches of the Aegean, where the Persian fleet first appeared, down through the island chains toward the major fleet anchorages, with each link in the chain covering an achievable visual distance. The critical point, and it bears emphasizing because it is easy to miss, is that none of those individual links needed to do anything extraordinary. Each watching station needed only to see the fire of its nearest neighbour, not the fire of a station 50 miles away, not the signal from across the whole expanse of sea. The extraordinary quality of the system emerged not from any single beacon, but from the cumulative effect of many ordinary beacons working together. The speed came from the fact that each link operated at roughly the speed of light, and human reaction time, even adding the delay of a watcher seeing a fire, raising the alarm and kindling his own beacon, was measured in minutes rather than hours. A warning that would have taken a road galley 3 or 4 hours to carry could propagate through the chain in something close to a single hour, possibly less. This is why geography was not simply a backdrop for the phryctoria, it was the hidden infrastructure of the entire system. The mountains and headlands and islands were doing the structural work that steel towers and relay amplifiers would do in a modern telecommunications network. They provided elevation. They provided natural intervisibility. They dictated where the stations had to go and by extension how fast the network could operate. The Greek engineers who built and maintained this system were, in a real sense, reading the landscape and translating its geometry into a communications architecture. The Aegean had been arranged by geological accident into something remarkably close to an ideal environment for optical telegraphy, and the Greeks, with their centuries of intimate maritime knowledge, recognized what they had and used it. So now that you understand the terrain those stations were built into, the natural question is, what exactly did a phryctoria look like in practice? And how did it actually function from one end of a relay chain to the other? The word itself comes from the Greek phryctos, meaning fire signal, and the phryctoria was the system as a whole, the coordinated network of beacon towers placed on elevated points, so that each one fell within the visual range of the next. It was not a single installation or a single technology. It was an operational architecture, a chain of fire and observation that stretched across coastlines and between islands, held together by fuel, discipline, and the readiness of the men assigned to watch the darkness. At each station, the physical setup was straightforward but demanding to maintain. You needed a high point, a hilltop, a ridge, a promontory that gave unobstructed sight lines in at least 2 directions along the chain. On that high point, you needed a platform or tower sufficient to raise the fire above any local obstruction and make it visible to the next station along the line. You needed a substantial stock of combustible material, kept dry and ready, dry wood, almost certainly supplemented by resinous timber, pine or pitch-treated fuel that would catch quickly and burn brightly rather than smouldering into a dim, ambiguous smoke column. The sources describe beacon materials being kept full-fed with fuel, which tells you something important. The fire that actually carried the signal was not lit from scratch when the alarm came. The fuel had to be prepared in advance, positioned, and kept in a condition where it could be ignited and producing a strong visible flame within minutes of the order to light. And then there was the watchman, the phryctoros. His role sounds simple in summary and was in practice one of the more psychologically demanding jobs the ancient world could assign to a person. He had to maintain a state of sustained readiness through the night, the hours when visibility was clearest, but human alertness is naturally at its lowest. During wartime or periods of known threat, that readiness was absolute. There was no acceptable reason for a watcher to be asleep when the neighbouring station's fire appeared over the horizon. The whole point of the system was speed, and speed required that the reaction time between seeing a signal and producing a new one be as short as possible. A watcher who nodded off for an hour and missed the first lighting of the previous station's beacon did not just delay the message. He broke the chain entirely, and the information died at his station. This is why the phryctoria required permanently manned stations to be genuinely reliable. You could not staff these positions only in emergencies, because an emergency by definition arrived without warning. The network had to be operating before the crisis began, watchers in position, fuel prepared, sight lines clear and monitored, so that when the signal came, it moved without interruption. That level of operational commitment, maintained day after day in peacetime as well as wartime, represented a significant investment of personnel and resources. It also meant the system was vulnerable in the way all human institutions are, to complacency, to corruption, to the mundane failures of administration that accumulate when nothing has happened for months, and the night watches start to feel like a waste of effort. The relay logic itself was elegant in its simplicity. When the watcher at any station saw the beacon of the previous station flare to life, that bright point of orange light appearing on a known hilltop or headland, he would immediately kindle his own fire. Not after sending a runner to confirm. Not after waiting to see if it stayed lit. The appearance of the signal was sufficient. His fire rose, and the watcher at the next station along the chain, who was watching the same darkness in the same state of readiness, would see it and light his own. Each station did not need to know anything about the source of the original alarm or its content. Each station only needed to know one thing. Is there a fire at the previous station? If yes, light your own. The simplicity of that logic was, paradoxically, what made the system so fast. There was no deliberation, no decoding, no chain of command to consult. There was fire, and then there was more fire. The cumulative result was remarkable. A signal that originated at the northern tip of the Aegean chain could reach a fleet anchorage or a city garrison far to the south, in a fraction of the time it would take any physical messenger to cover the same distance. Each link in the chain consumed only the minutes needed for a watcher to see a fire and kindle his own. Multiply that by the number of stations, and you still arrive at a travel time measured in an hour or two rather than the full day or more that a rowed galley would require in favourable conditions, and several days if conditions were poor. Those strengths, speed over distance, simplicity of operation, minimal equipment, gave the phryctoria genuine strategic value that ancient commanders understood and relied upon. But the limitations were equally real and equally important to understand, because they defined the edges of what the system could actually accomplish. The most fundamental limitation was the poverty of the message. An early beacon said one thing, fire. It could mean enemy sighted if that was the pre-arranged signal, or fleet approaching if a different arrangement had been specified in advance. But those meanings had to be agreed upon before the signal was sent. There was no mechanism, in the earliest versions of the system, for communicating anything that had not been anticipated. If the threat turned out to be something unexpected, a fleet larger than feared, an approach from the wrong direction, a friendly force that needed to be distinguished from a hostile one, the beacon could not carry that nuance. It could only say what it had been set up to say, and everything beyond that had to wait for a messenger who could speak. False alarms compounded this limitation by eroding the trust that made the system work. A fire lit in error, or seen at a different station and misidentified as a beacon, could send a fleet to battle stations against an enemy that did not exist. And the network's absolute dependence on clear conditions meant that bad weather, fog, heavy rain, dust haze over the islands, could sever the chain entirely at its most critical moment. The system was powerful precisely when conditions were favourable. A clear night, a well-maintained fire, a watchful and alert phryctoros at every station along the line. When any of those conditions failed, the chain broke, and the signal stopped wherever the break occurred. These were not trivial problems, and the Greeks knew it. The history of the phryctoria is, in part, the history of people trying to work around those limitations, to give the fire a richer vocabulary, to make the message carry more than a single undifferentiated alarm. But that came later. First came the basic system, the fire on the hilltop, the watcher in the dark, and the relay that let a single moment of crisis travel faster than any ship could sail. Understanding why the system worked requires stepping back from the historical record and looking at a set of physical constraints that the Greeks navigated intuitively, but that modern optics and geometry allow us to quantify more precisely. The question of how far a fire can actually be seen from the sea is not a simple one. It involves the curvature of the earth, the height of the observer, the intensity of the flame, and the atmospheric conditions at the moment of observation, and each of those factors pushes the answer in different directions depending on circumstances. Start with the most fundamental constraint, the horizon. The earth curves away beneath you at a rate determined purely by geometry, and no light, however bright, can bend around that curve without some form of atmospheric assistance. For an observer at sea level, a sailor standing on the deck of a trireme, perhaps 1.5 meters above the water, the geometric horizon lies roughly 5 kilometers away. That is not a long distance. A fire burning on a beach 5 kilometers ahead would be visible. A fire burning 6 kilometers away, even an enormous one, would have its base cut off by the curve of the earth, and if the flame was low enough, the whole fire would disappear below the horizon entirely. This is why elevation mattered so much, and why the placement of beacon towers on hilltops and headlands was not simply a matter of local tradition or military instinct. It was a direct response to the geometry of visibility. Raise the fire higher, and you push its geometric horizon outward. The formula governing this relationship is straightforward. The horizon distance in kilometers scales with the square root of the observer's height in kilometers. A fire on a tower 40 meters above sea level commands a geometric horizon of roughly 22 kilometers. But the observer also has their own horizon, and when you combine the two, the maximum distance at which the elevated fire can be seen by a sea level observer works out to approximately 32 kilometers, or just under 20 miles, under clear atmospheric conditions. Modern GIS visibility modelling of ancient coastal fire sites has produced exactly this figure, estimating the brightness of a typical wood fire at around 5,000 candelas and confirming that 32 kilometers represents the practical limit for that configuration before Earth's curvature intervenes. That number matters because it maps almost exactly onto what the ancient sources describe, Greek phryctoria stations were spaced roughly 20 miles apart, approximately 30 kilometers, which means the standard station interval was calibrated to fit within the reliable visibility range of a 40-meter tower fire. The spacing was not arbitrary or based on administrative convenience. It was the result, whether arrived at through calculation or accumulated experience, of placing stations just close enough that a well-maintained fire at one would reliably be seen at the next under typical nighttime conditions. That correspondence between the geometric model and the operational practice is striking, and it suggests the system's designers, whoever they were, working over whatever span of time, had a functional understanding of how far fire carried across open water. Now push the elevation higher. Replace a 40-meter tower on flat coastal ground with a genuinely tall promontory, a hilltop 500 meters above sea level, of the kind that the Aegean coastline and its islands provide in abundance. The horizon calculation for that height gives approximately 61 kilometers, or close to 38 miles, to a sea level observer. Add favorable atmospheric conditions, the kind of exceptional clarity that comes on a cold, calm night with dry air and no haze over the water, and the effective range extends further still. This is where the figure of 50 miles enters the picture, but it is important to be precise about what that number actually represents. The 50-mile figure is a modern upper bound estimate derived from geometric calculations under idealized conditions. It is not a claim found in ancient sources. No Greek writer sat down and measured the maximum range of a specific beacon at a specific site and recorded 50 miles as the result. What the modern analysis shows is that on an exceptionally tall natural elevation, burning a large fire on a clear night, the theoretical geometric limit of visibility approaches that range. It represents the outer boundary of what the physics permits, not the routine operational performance of the average station. Most stations most nights were working with the 32-kilometer figure or something close to it, which was already sufficient for the relay spacing they used, and already remarkable by the standards of any pre-industrial communications technology. The distinction matters because it helps separate two different things that sometimes get conflated when the system's range is discussed. The typical station spacing tells you about normal operational performance. The upper bound visibility figure tells you about exceptional cases, the longest single links in the chain, the hilltops that may have served as regional anchors connecting sections of the network that lower ground could not bridge. Byzantine beacon stations, built centuries later with the same underlying logic, were placed roughly 60 miles apart in open terrain, which demonstrates that later engineers were deliberately exploiting high ground to extend individual link ranges well beyond the norm. That comparative benchmark is useful precisely because it confirms that longer spacings were achievable when the topography permitted, but also that they required exceptional elevation to work at all. For sailors at sea, the geometry created a particular challenge that coastal tower observers did not face in the same way. A watcher on an elevated coastal tower could see across dozens of kilometers to the fire at the next station, his own height adding to the combined visibility range. A sailor watching from the deck of a ship sat only a few meters above water, his personal horizon barely beyond a few kilometers. To see a beacon that might be 30 kilometers away on the opposite coast, that sailor needed the fire to be high enough that its geometric visibility extended all the way to his position despite his own low vantage point. This explains why signals intended for fleets at sea required elevated coastal towers and could not have been replicated by fires at the waterline. The tower's height was doing work that the ship could not do for itself. A sailor who climbed the mast might extend his own horizon somewhat, but the primary engineering solution to the problem of shipboard visibility was always on land, in the elevation of the fire, not on the vessel trying to see it. What this physical analysis reveals is that the system's designers were solving a genuinely non-trivial optical engineering problem, and solving it well, even if they would not have described it in those terms. They understood through experience, if not through formula, that height determined range, that station spacing had to match visible range, and that a chain of fires could carry information faster than any physical messenger across a geometry that would otherwise defeat communication. The fires that burned on those hilltops were not simply large candles. They were carefully positioned instruments, placed to exploit exactly the narrow window of visibility that elevation, distance, and atmospheric clarity made available on any given night. So the system could carry light across 30 kilometers of open water with remarkable reliability. The geometry worked, the engineering worked, but here's the question that follows immediately from that achievement, and it is a more uncomfortable one. Once the fire was seen, what exactly did it mean? The honest answer is that it could mean very few things, and everyone involved had to agree on those meanings in advance. Early Greek beacon systems were not open channels for communication in any modern sense. They were more like a handful of preloaded triggers, each one corresponding to a single prearranged message that commanders on both ends had agreed upon before the chain was ever lit. There was no capacity for improvisation, no mechanism for clarification, and no way to add nuance after the fact. The fire appeared, and the recipient knew what that appearance had been decided to signify. Nothing more and nothing less than what the code said before the crisis began. In practice, this meant the system's vocabulary was built from the most urgent and universal military facts. Enemy sighted, Allied fleet approaching, withdraw to new anchorage, mobilize now. These are the kinds of signals that appear either explicitly or implicitly in the ancient sources that record the system actually being used. They share something important. They are binary or near binary facts that can be compressed into a single event, fire or no fire, flame here or flame there, without ambiguity. Either the enemy has been sighted or they have not. Either the fleet is approaching or it is not. The message fits the medium precisely because it demands no elaboration. What this created was a system with extraordinary speed but extremely narrow bandwidth. A flame could carry the essential fact of Persian warships rounding a headland across 30 kilometers of water in what amounted to seconds, the time it took for the fire to catch and the distant observer to register the light. Compare that to the alternative. A fast-rowing vessel covering the same distance might take 3 hours in good conditions and considerably longer in bad ones. The beacon did not just win that race, it made the comparison almost meaningless. But the speed came at a direct cost, and that cost was expressibility. The channel that moved information so fast had almost no room in it for complexity. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era, put this criticism with unusual directness. He acknowledged that fire signals were swift and useful for conveying predetermined messages, but argued that they became effectively useless the moment events deviated from what had been anticipated. His objection was precise. The system could not express unforeseen details. If you had arranged a signal to mean enemy fleet approaching, the signal told you nothing about whether that fleet contained 20 ships or 200. It told you nothing about which direction they came from, whether they were moving fast or holding position, whether they had already engaged another force, or whether they appeared to be making for a specific harbour. The flame arrived, the message was received, and the recipient knew only what the pre-arrangement had specified, a binary fact stripped of every dimension that might actually shape the response. This is not a trivial limitation when you consider the military situations in which the system was deployed. A commander receiving the signal "enemy sighted" has to decide how many troops to mobilize, which direction to march them, whether to seek battle or defensive ground, and how urgently to strip resources from other areas. All of those decisions depend on information the basic beacon system simply could not carry. The speed of the signal outran the intelligence behind it, delivering an alarm faster than any courier, while leaving the recipient with far less to act on than a courier's verbal report would have provided. There was also a reliability dimension to the simplicity that is worth appreciating. A system with only a handful of pre-agreed signals is, in a mechanical sense, extremely robust. There is very little that can go wrong between sender and receiver in terms of misinterpretation, as long as the initial agreement was clear. The message is not degraded by distance, not garbled by the chain of transmission, not subject to the errors of memory or the distortions of a tired runner recounting what he witnessed. The fire either appears or it does not, and if it appears, the meaning is fixed. That robustness was not incidental. It was probably a large part of why the system persisted and expanded across the Greek world for centuries. When the alternative was a messenger who might misremember, misunderstand, be captured, be delayed, or simply die before arriving, a signal that was guaranteed to carry its meaning intact had genuine value even if that meaning was narrow. But the gap between what the system could say and what commanders actually needed to know was real, and it grew more visible the more ambitious the strategic context became. Simple coastal watchposts alerting a nearby fleet that the enemy was in the vicinity. That was a problem the beacons solved well. Coordinating complex multi-wing operations across hundreds of kilometers of coastline, communicating about troop numbers and ship counts and contingency orders and updated intelligence. That was a problem the basic beacon system could not touch. Every fixed vocabulary system hits this wall eventually. The more you use it, the more you notice the edges of what it cannot say. And this is where the ancient record begins to generate a particular kind of suspense, because the problem Polybius described so clearly was not unique to him. It must have been felt by every military commander who ever watched a distant fire appear and realized he had no way to ask a follow-up question. The signal had travelled at the speed of light and told him almost nothing he did not already know to expect. What he needed was not simply a faster channel for pre-agreed facts. He needed a way to compose a message on one end and read it, intact and specific, on the other. He needed, in short, something closer to language. The question of how you send more than a handful of fixed messages across open water using only torches and hilltops was not just a technical puzzle. It was the central unsolved problem of ancient optical communication, and the Greek world knew it. What came next was an attempt to solve it, and the solution was considerably more ingenious than a bonfire. The solution, when it came, arrived not from a general or an admiral, but from engineers, men who approached the problem of beacon, signalling the way architects approached a flawed building, identify the structural weakness, redesign from first principles, and rebuild something with greater capacity. Their names were Cleoxenes and Democritus, and working in the 2nd century before the Common Era, they produced something that deserves to be recognized as one of the more remarkable intellectual leaps in the ancient world. They did not simply improve the existing system, they replaced its foundational logic entirely. The old phryctoria network was built on a single implicit assumption, that the message could be decided in advance. Every signal in the system corresponded to a pre-agreed meaning, and the only question was whether the fire appeared. Cleoxenes and Democritus identified that assumption as the ceiling on the system's usefulness, and they tore it out. What they proposed instead was a method for encoding not pre-selected messages, but individual letters, which meant in turn that anyone operating their apparatus could compose any word, and any word in sequence could build any sentence, and the entire expressive range of written Greek suddenly became, at least in principle, available to a hillside operator holding torches in the dark. Their system was called the pyrseia, from the Greek word for torch signalling, and its mechanism was elegant in the way that genuinely clever solutions tend to be, simple enough to explain in a sentence, powerful enough to transform what was possible. They took the Greek alphabet and arranged it in a table, 5 rows, 5 columns, 25 positions covering the letters of the alphabet, with one merged entry to complete the grid. Then they assigned 2 groups of torches, one held on the left side of the signalling platform and one on the right. The left group indicated which row the intended letter occupied. The right group indicated which column. To transmit the letter that occupied the 3rd row and the 5th column, the operator raised 3 torches on the left and 5 on the right. The receiver, equipped with an identical table, cross-referenced the 2 numbers and read a specific letter. Then the process repeated for the next letter and the next until the message was complete. What the system produced was something that had never existed before in the history of long-distance communication, a general-purpose alphabet transmittable by light. Not a set of 10 agreed signals or 20 or 50, but the full range of human language, letter by letter at a distance measured in kilometers. The receiver no longer needed to have anticipated the message. They needed only to have the table, and the discipline to count torches accurately, and the patience to build letters into words as they arrived. This row and column logic may look familiar to anyone who has encountered the history of codes and ciphers, because it is the direct structural ancestor of what later became known as the Polybius square, a method of encoding letters through numerical coordinates that Polybius himself described, and that remained in use in various forms across centuries of cryptographic practice. The Polybius square is often taught as a cipher, a tool for concealing meaning, but its origins in the pyrseia reveal something more interesting. It was invented not to hide information, but to transmit it across empty space. The grid was a solution to a communications problem before it was ever a solution to a secrecy problem, and the intellectual leap made by Cleoxenes and Democritus was essentially the insight that any symbol can be located by two coordinates, and two groups of visible objects can represent those coordinates from a great distance. The contrast with what came before deserves a moment of careful attention, because it is easy to underestimate how dramatic the shift actually was. Earlier beacon operators worked with a vocabulary that might contain half a dozen messages on a good day. They could say, in effect, "Danger is coming," or "The fleet has arrived," or "Fall back now." These were urgent, important facts, the kind of information that could save a fleet or buy a city time to close its gates. But they were fixed facts, incapable of elaboration, unable to carry anything the recipients had not already imagined. The system did not transmit information so much as it activated preloaded expectations. The pyrseia changed the nature of the transaction from signal retrieval to actual reading. Instead of a fire that either appeared or did not, and meant what you had agreed it would mean, you now had an apparatus capable of constructing messages that neither operator had composed before the night began. A commander at a beacon station could in principle receive intelligence about a specific number of enemy ships, a specific direction of approach, a specific request for a particular kind of reinforcement. The message could include details that no one had thought to prearrange because the channel was no longer locked to prearranged options. It was open. That said, it is worth being precise about what the pyrseia was and was not, because the temptation to project modern ideas onto an ancient innovation is real. This was not conversation. The system was slow, because transmitting a full message one letter at a time, counting torches in darkness, cross-referencing a table, and recording each letter as it arrived required patience, coordination, and favorable conditions at every step. It required trained operators on both ends who understood the table and could maintain concentration through an extended sequence of signals without error. It required clear weather because torches that could not be distinguished could not be counted, and miscounted torches produced wrong letters, wrong words, wrong messages. The error rate for a complex message transmitted across a rough sea under imperfect visibility was probably non-trivial, and there was no obvious mechanism for asking the sender to repeat a garbled letter without a prearranged signal for that purpose. What the pyrseia represented was not a fully developed telecommunications infrastructure in any modern sense. It was something more specific and arguably more significant, a conceptual breakthrough. It demonstrated that light could carry arbitrary information, not just flags of warning, but the full texture of language. The distance between a handful of pre-agreed fire signals and a torch-encoded alphabet is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. One system moves a binary fact, the other moves meaning. That distinction is the reason the pyrseia sits at a particular inflection point in the history of communication, the moment when the ancient world moved from signaling to messaging, from triggering a pre-loaded response to composing a thought and sending it across the sea. The fires on the hilltops were the same fires that had always burned. What changed was what they were now capable of saying. So how exactly did it work in practice? Understanding the pyrseia in principle is one thing. Watching it operate in your mind's eye, moment by moment, torch by torch, is another. And the gap between those two things is where most of the system's real complexity lived. Start with the equipment. On each signalling platform, operators maintained 2 sets of torch holders arranged in rows. Each set could hold up to 5 torches. Call them the left wall and the right wall. These were not decorative or symbolic. They were the 2 digits of a coordinate system, and every letter of the Greek alphabet had been assigned coordinates on a master table. The table divided the alphabet into 5 groups of 5 characters, laid out in rows. The left-hand torches told the receiver which row to look at. The right-hand torches told the receiver which position within that row, which column, held the intended letter. 3 torches on the left and 2 on the right meant, go to the 3rd row, find the 2nd character. That character was your letter. Lower the torches, raise the next combination, and the letter after it began to emerge from the darkness. The logic is clean, but before a single letter could be sent, both stations had to be synchronized, and the system's designers understood that synchronization was not something you could assume, it was something you had to earn, signal by signal. Before transmitting a letter, the sending station raised a preparatory signal, typically 2 torches, to alert the receiver that a new code was coming. The receiving station mirrored that signal back, confirming that they were watching and ready. Only after both sides had acknowledged the exchange, and both had lowered their torches to clear the display, did the actual letter sequence go up. This back-and-forth handshake was not a formality. It was the mechanism that prevented the receiver from misreading mid-sequence, from counting torches that were still being raised or already being lowered, from confusing preparation for content. Think about how much discipline that required of both crews. The receiver had to be watching and the sender had the corresponding obligation to raise each combination cleanly and hold it long enough for the receiver to count without rushing, to lower completely before the next handshake, to maintain the rhythm of the sequence across the full length of the message. Polybius, the historian who documented the system in detail, was explicit that this demanded practice and habituation. He was not making a casual observation. He was identifying the system's primary vulnerability, which was not the cleverness of the code but the human beings executing it. Two operators who had drilled together under good conditions and developed a shared rhythm could move through letters efficiently. Two operators who had only read the instructions faced a system that could, and almost certainly would, generate errors that neither end could easily detect or correct without a prearranged protocol for requesting repetition. This brings us to the question of speed, which is where the gap between theoretical power and real-world performance becomes most visible. In theory, the pyrseia could transmit any letter in the Greek alphabet, which meant any word, which meant any sentence. In theory, a commander with pressing intelligence could construct a precise, detailed message and send it across miles of open water. In practice, the rate at which that could happen was constrained by every element of the process: the handshake before each letter, the time needed to raise and hold and lower each torch configuration, the pause while the receiver confirmed, the time required to record each letter before the next arrived. Modern experimental reconstructions of the system, modeling the torch and coordination process under realistic conditions, have measured the practical transfer rate at roughly 50 letters per hour. That is approximately one letter every 70 to 75 seconds. 50 letters an hour sounds painfully slow by any contemporary standard, but place it against what came before and the picture shifts. A pre-coded beacon system that could only say 5 things could say those 5 things nearly instantaneously. The fire either appeared or it did not, and the meaning was immediate. The pyrseia sacrificed that speed for something the earlier system could not offer at any speed: specificity. A 50-letter message transmitted over an hour could name a location, describe a force, specify a number, and issue a conditional instruction. That was genuinely new, and the trade-off was arguably rational given the military and naval context in which such precision could change outcomes. Visibility, of course, complicated everything. The handshake system worked beautifully when operators on both sides could see each other's torches clearly enough to count individual flames at distance. Under ideal conditions, dark sky, clear air, a well-positioned fire, and trained eyes, this was achievable. Under anything less than ideal conditions, individual torches began to blur and merge. The difference between 2 flames and 3, which was the difference between entirely different letters, could collapse across a few miles of haze or sea spray into something indistinguishable. Experienced operators likely developed habits for minimizing this ambiguity, spacing torches as widely as possible within their holders, using the highest, most exposed positions on their platforms, holding combinations for longer when atmospheric conditions were poor. But none of these compensations were perfect, and a mistaken letter anywhere in a sequence could corrupt the meaning of what followed in ways that neither end might recognize until the full message was assembled and read back as nonsense. What this means is that the pyrseia's performance existed on a spectrum. At one end, trained crews, clear night, calm air, short message, high accuracy. At the other end, inexperienced operators, rough weather, marginal visibility, long complex communication, mounting error. Most real operational use probably fell somewhere between those poles, which is why Polybius's emphasis on training was so pointed. The code itself was not the limiting factor. The limiting factor was always the human beings holding the torches and counting from a distance, translating light into letters into meaning across kilometers of open darkness. The pyrseia was in this sense a system that rewarded investment. Stations with crews who had practiced together extensively, who knew each other's rhythms and had calibrated their timing across repeated drills, could extract significantly more from it than stations staffed with men who had memorized the table but never built the coordination that made it usable under pressure. The intellectual architecture was elegant. Executing that architecture with speed, accuracy, and consistency under field conditions was something else entirely, a discipline that had to be built, maintained, and passed on like any other craft skill, because the alphabet made of fire was only as good as the hands and eyes that spoke it. All of that theoretical capacity, the alphabet, the handshakes, the trained crews counting torches in the dark, finds its sharpest justification not in a philosopher's treatise or an engineer's design notes, but in a moment of genuine crisis recorded by Herodotus. The year is 480 BC. The Persian Empire under Xerxes is moving west and south with a force that by any measure dwarfs anything the Greek world has assembled to meet it. The Persian fleet alone, as Herodotus tells it, numbers over 1,200 warships, a figure that modern historians regard as inflated, but which nonetheless points toward a naval force of staggering scale. The Greek fleet, positioned at Artemisium on the northern coast of Euboea, has been tasked with watching the wide Thracian Sea and guarding the maritime approach to Thermopylae. What happens next at a small island called Sciathus turns the abstract mechanics of the beacon network into a question of strategic survival. Sciathus sits in the northern Aegean, roughly at the entrance to the passage the Persian fleet needed to navigate southward. When Xerxes advanced ships, Herodotus says 10 of the fastest vessels in the Persian fleet came sweeping directly towards Sciathus. The Greeks stationed there had only one practical option for alerting the fleet at Artemisium: fire. They lit the beacons across the chain of high points that connected Sciathus to the Greek positions. The signal moved. The fleet at Artemisium received the warning, processed what it meant, and acted. Withdrawing from Artemisium to Chalcis, further south along the Euripus, the narrow channel between Euboea and the Greek mainland. The Euripus was defensible in ways that an open anchorage was not. The Persian fleet's advantage in numbers would matter far less in a constricted passage than in open water. That redeployment was not the result of a scout ship racing back with verbal intelligence, nor of a courier riding overland with a written report. It was the result of fire on a hilltop, a signal transmitted faster than any ship could sail the same distance, received before the Persians had time to consolidate their advance, and acted upon with enough margin to reposition forces to ground of the Greeks' choosing. The beacon at Sciathus did not simply announce that something was happening. It gave the Greek commanders the one thing that turns a dangerous situation into a manageable one: time. This is the point at which the system stops being an engineering curiosity and starts being something that shaped the course of events. The Persian wars hinged on Greek coordination, land forces at Thermopylae working in concert with naval forces at sea, each position dependent on the other holding long enough for a combined strategy to function. Losing the fleet to a surprise engagement in open water, caught unaware by a Persian approach before they could form a coherent tactical response, would have unravelled the entire defensive arrangement. The beacon at Sciathus was not a spectacle. It was actionable military intelligence delivered at a speed that no alternative could match, and the Greek commanders treated it as exactly that. What makes this episode particularly significant is that it demonstrates something the system's critics, ancient and modern, sometimes underestimate. The phryctoria was not primarily a land communication tool that occasionally sent messages to the coast. It was a genuinely maritime intelligence network, oriented specifically around naval awareness. The beacons at Sciathus were watching the sea approaches. The signal they sent was about ship movements, fleet positions, and the direction of an advancing naval threat. The recipients were sailors and naval commanders, not garrison troops or city officials. The entire chain, from the observer on the hilltop who saw the Persian sails, to the lighting of the first beacon to the final signal reaching Artemisium, was designed to project human observation beyond the horizon and deliver what that observation found to people whose decisions depended on knowing it. This is what a coastal beacon network actually does. that a single observer cannot. A lookout stationed on the shore at Artemisium could see, on a clear day, roughly as far as the curvature of the earth and local topography permitted, perhaps 20 miles under ideal conditions, probably less under the atmospheric conditions of a summer campaign. Sciathus lies further north than that line of sight allowed. Without the beacon relay, the fleet at Artemisium would have had no warning until the Persian ships were already within striking distance. With the relay, the effective range of their observation extended across the island chain, multiplying what any individual lookout could see into a surveillance envelope that covered the approaches to the entire theatre of operations. Each beacon station in the chain was doing something conceptually simple, receiving light, producing light, but the cumulative effect of linking those stations together was genuinely transformative. The observation made by a single man on a hilltop at Sciathus became, within the time it took fire to move from peak to peak, a piece of intelligence available to a fleet commander 50 miles away. The man on the hilltop did not need to understand naval strategy. The fleet commander did not need to be within eyeshot of the Persian advance. The network bridged that gap, and in doing so it amplified human perception in a way that had no precedent in the ancient world. There is a temptation, when reading Herodotus's account, to absorb it as background colour, one detail among dozens in a vast narrative about the Persian wars. Resist that temptation. The withdrawal from Artemisium to Chalcis was not a minor adjustment. It placed the Greek fleet in a position to contest the Euripus, to protect the flank of the forces at Thermopylae, and to maintain the strategic coherence of the entire combined operation for as long as that operation held together. The intelligence that enabled that repositioning arrived via fire on stone. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to work, under the conditions it was supposed to handle, at a moment when the cost of its failure would have been catastrophic. Herodotus does not editorialize about the technology. He records the event with the matter-of-fact tone of a historian describing something his audience would have found entirely familiar, because by his time beacon networks on the Greek coast were not remarkable in principle. What was remarkable was the scale of the threat they had been called upon to report, and the precision with which that report had been received and acted upon. The Sciathus beacon is not a legend about the power of fire. It is documentation that a communication system spanning open water, linking island to mainland across miles of sea, had been built, maintained, and deployed effectively enough to influence the movement of fleets during the largest naval confrontation the ancient Mediterranean world had yet seen. The Sciathus episode sits inside the Persian Wars, an era of such extreme historical magnitude that it sometimes feels like a category unto itself, a crisis so total that the technologies and tactics deployed during it exist in a kind of exceptional space. But the phryctoria was not an emergency instrument that Greek cities dusted off only when Persian fleets appeared on the horizon. It was a standing infrastructure embedded in the political and military routines of a world defined by interstate competition, shifting alliances, and the constant possibility that a neighbour's fleet might round a headland before your own forces were ready to receive it. Thucydides gives us the proof. The year is 427 BC. The place is Corcyra, the large island that sits off the northwestern coast of Greece at the entrance to the Adriatic, occupying a position of such strategic importance that Thucydides himself, at the opening of his history, identified the Corcyraean question as one of the catalysts of the Peloponnesian War. Corcyra had one of the largest fleets in the Greek world, and whoever controlled it, or denied it to the other side, held a significant advantage in the western theatre of the war. At this particular moment in 427, the island is not simply divided between Sparta and Athens in the abstract sense that most Greek city-states had been forced to choose between those two poles. It is actively tearing itself apart, a vicious civil conflict between the city's democratic faction, aligned with Athens, and its oligarchic faction, supported by Corinth and Sparta, has degenerated into street-by-street violence, political assassination, and the kind of mutual atrocity that Thucydides describes elsewhere as the signature disease of civil war in a time of general war. Into this already volatile situation came the signal. Toward nightfall, Thucydides records the Corcyrians were informed by beacon signals of the approach of 60 Athenian vessels from Locas under the command of Eurymedon. 60 ships. That number requires a moment's consideration. 60 Athenian triremes represented a substantial expeditionary force, the kind of fleet that could decisively alter the military balance inside the island, reinforcing the democratic faction, threatening the Peloponnesian ships already in Corcyrian waters, and signalling to every party involved that Athens intended to defend its interests in the west with serious naval power. For the oligarchs and their Corinthian and Spartan allies, the arrival of such a force without warning would have been catastrophic. For the democratic faction, knowing those ships were coming gave them something equally important: options. The effect was immediate, with the beacon warning received before darkness fully settled. The Corcyrians moved the Messenian troops inside the city walls, shifted their own fleet into the Hyllaic harbour, and made clear to the Peloponnesian forces that the strategic situation had changed. The Peloponnesians, facing the prospect of being caught between a hostile city and an approaching Athenian fleet, chose withdrawal. The crisis did not disappear, but it did not culminate in the catastrophic confrontation that might otherwise have unfolded: a night engagement or a dawn battle on unfavourable terms, with the defenders caught mid-reorganisation and the attackers already in position. What the beacon gave the Corcyrians was not simply information, it gave them hours. The approach of 60 ships from the direction of Leucas meant a journey of some distance across open water, a journey that the beacons reported well before the fleet itself came within sight of the island. That interval, between the signal arriving and the sails appearing on the horizon, was the operational gift the network provided. Troops repositioned, harbour approaches secured, tactical decisions made with some margin for deliberation, rather than under the immediate pressure of an enemy already in range. In ancient naval warfare, where the tempo of events could shift from strategic manoeuvring to irreversible close-quarter combat within an hour, the difference between reacting at nightfall to a signal and reacting at dawn to an actual fleet was not a minor advantage. It was frequently the entire margin between a coordinated response and a rout. This dynamic is not unique to Corcyra. It mirrors, almost structurally, what happened at Sciathus and Artemisium half a century earlier. In both cases, a beacon warned a naval force before visual contact with the approaching fleet was possible. In both cases, that warning prompted an immediate strategic repositioning. In both cases, the value of the intelligence lay not in its complexity. Neither message was elaborate, but in its speed and its reach, in the fact that it arrived across open water faster than any ship could carry the same information, delivered by a network that extended the effective range of human observation far beyond what any single lookout position could provide. The parallel between these two episodes is worth holding clearly in mind, because it does something important for how we understand the phryctoria. These are not two accounts from the same source with a shared political agenda, or two episodes from the same conflict that might reflect a particular tradition of military storytelling. Sciathus is Herodotus, 480 BC, the Persian Wars, an existential confrontation with an outside imperial power. Corcyra is Thucydides, 427 BC, the Peloponnesian War, an internal Greek conflict of an entirely different character. One involves a Greek fleet watching the approach of a foreign enemy across the northern Aegean. The other involves a city-state, navigating the arrival of an allied fleet amid a civil war that was simultaneously a proxy front in a much larger Greek conflict. The circumstances, the authors, the decades, and the geographic settings are all different. The mechanism is the same. That recurrence is precisely what transforms these two cases from interesting historical footnotes into something with genuine evidential weight. If the beacon system appeared in the record only once, it might be possible to treat it as an exceptional measure adopted for exceptional circumstances. Appearing in Herodotus for a Persian threat, and in Thucydides for a crisis of inter-Greek politics, spanning different decades and different strategic contexts, it begins to look like what it almost certainly was: standard operational practice, a piece of infrastructure that Greek communities on the coast and islands maintained because the need for rapid maritime intelligence was not periodic but chronic. The Greek world of the 5th century BC was not a world of stable borders and predictable relations between states. It was a world where alliance structures shifted season by season, where a fleet that was your allies this year might be your enemies next, and where the first indication of another city's intentions might arrive on the water before any diplomatic channel could carry word overland. In that environment, the ability to learn hours in advance that 60 ships were approaching from Lucas was not a luxury. It was a basic condition of political and military survival. Thucydides records the Corcyra beacon with the same matter-of-fact economy that Herodotus brought to Sciathus. Neither historian pauses to explain how the system worked, because neither expected his audience to need the explanation. The beacons were known. What mattered was what they reported, and what the people who received the report did with the time they had gained. Both of those episodes, Sciathus and Corcyra, share something that deserves closer examination, something that tends to get absorbed into the drama of the events themselves without receiving the scrutiny it warrants. In both cases, the beacons were not simply passing information between two fixed points on land. They were reaching out across open water to ships, moving targets, vessels with no permanent address on the landscape, crewed by men whose line of sight to the shore was defined not by hilltop elevation or tower height, but by where they happened to be standing on a deck a few meters above the waterline. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear, because the geometry of visibility is unforgiving, and it does not treat all observers equally. Stand on a hilltop 80 meters above the sea, and your geometric horizon extends roughly 32 kilometers. Build a beacon tower 40 meters high on a coastal promontory, and a fire burning on its platform can, under clear conditions, be seen from approximately the same distance, around 32 kilometers or just under 20 miles. Modern GIS modeling of ancient fire intensities confirms this range as realistic for a well-maintained bonfire on such a structure in clear night air against a dark sky. Move the observer to higher ground, a prominent hill rising to 80 meters or more above the water, and that figure pushes toward 50 kilometers. These are not trivial distances. They are the foundation of the 50-mile claim, and under the right conditions they are geometrically defensible. Now put that observer on a ship. A sailor standing on the deck of a trireme sits roughly 4 meters above the waterline. At that height, the geometric horizon extends to approximately 7 kilometers, less than 5 miles. That is the maximum distance at which a person at deck level can see the curvature of the earth yield to open water without something taller in between. A lookout perched at the top of a mast gained a few additional meters of height and a few additional kilometers of range, but not dramatically so. The fundamental constraint was the ship's proximity to sea level, and no amount of attentiveness or good eyesight could overcome what the Earth's curvature simply put below the horizon. The practical consequence is that the theoretical maximum range of a coastal beacon, 30, 40 or even 50 kilometers under favorable conditions, was accessible to ships only when those ships were within a specific zone near the coast. Combining the geometry of a 40-meter tower with a 4-meter deck elevation, the combined line-of-sight horizon for ship and shore comes to roughly 30 kilometers. That is the outer limit of the geometry, achievable only in clear conditions with no atmospheric interference. Fog, haze, or overcast skies, all common in the Aegean, could cut that practical range to 10 or 15 kilometers without difficulty. This does not undermine the beacon system. It clarifies where and when it actually worked. The Greek world that used these fires was not a world of open ocean navigation in the modern sense. Greek seamanship in the classical period was fundamentally coastal and island hopping. Triremes preferred to beach at night rather than ride at anchor in exposed waters. Fleets followed well-established routes through recognizable sea lanes, passing between islands and through straits, rather than striking out across featureless expanses of deep water. The geography that made the phryctoria network possible, the same geography of elevated headlands, close-spaced islands and narrow channels that gave each beacon tower its line of sight to the next, was also the geography through which ships moved as a matter of operational routine. The Sciathus Strait, where beacons warned the Greek fleet of the Persian approach, is precisely such a channel. Ships navigating between the island of Sciathus and the Magnesian peninsula of the mainland passed through a confined corridor where the distances to shore were measured in a few tens of kilometers at most, where hilltop fires on the island would have been within the visible range of vessels moving through the passage. The Corcyra Channel presents a similar situation. Eurymedon's 60 ships approaching from Leucas were following a coastal route that brought them close enough to the island's elevated western coast for the beacon signal to travel the other direction, from a shore position to the fleet, or for scouts and lookout posts on Corcyra's heights to observe the fleet's approach and immediately trigger the signal network on shore. In both scenarios, the critical feature is not the theoretical maximum range of the beacon system. It is the fact that ships in these corridors were, by the nature of the route they were sailing, already within a range where tall coastal fires could reach them. The beacons were not doing something exotic or technically extraordinary. They were doing something geometrically reliable because the maritime geography funneled ships into exactly the zones where the geometry of elevated fire and low-deck observation could intersect. Where the 50-mile figure requires careful handling is in the implicit suggestion that this kind of communication was available anywhere on the open sea. It was not a fleet sailing across the centre of the Aegean, far from any coast. It was beyond the practical reach of any shore-based signal. No beacon tower built in the ancient world could bridge that gap to a ship at sea level. The theoretical maximum of 50 miles applies to an observer on high ground watching another high ground position, hilltop to hilltop, tower to elevated tower, not shore to ship in deep water. The honest version of the claim is more specific, and in some ways more interesting, that along the strategic maritime corridors of the Greek world, in the straits and channels and island passages through which fleets actually moved, elevated coastal beacons could communicate with ships approaching or transiting those passages at ranges of 20 to 30 kilometers under clear conditions, and that this was entirely sufficient for the operational purposes the system served. There is also the question of whether ships themselves could trigger the network rather than simply receive it. If a lookout on Sciathus could see Persian ships entering the strait, the causation could run in either direction. Shore sees fleet, shore signals coast, or fleet sees shore beacon already lit by an even earlier warning from further north. In practice, both mechanisms were probably in play, with the network functioning as a connected system rather than a simple one-way broadcast. Scouts positioned on the most exposed headlands fed information inward, and the fires they lit carried that information both along the coast and out across the water lanes to any ship close enough to receive it. What the beacon network offered ships, then, was not universal coverage of the sea. It was something more precisely valuable, early warning along the routes that mattered, at the moments when fleets were most exposed and most in need of intelligence, as they entered a strait, rounded a cape, or approached an island controlled by a potentially hostile power. Those were the moments that decided battles and political crises alike, and those were exactly the moments and places where the fires were positioned to reach them. What emerges from all of this, the tower spacing, the relay logic, the case studies at Sciathus and Corcyra, the geometry of ship-to-shore visibility, is something larger than the sum of its individual fires. Taken together, the phryctoria network was not simply a collection of useful watchposts. It was a system, and the distinction is fundamental to understanding what the Greeks had actually built. A single beacon tower is an alarm. It tells you something is wrong in whatever direction the fire faces. But a chain of beacon towers, spaced at regular intervals across a coastline, and coordinated by prior agreement about what each signal means, is an entirely different kind of technology. It is infrastructure. It has architecture, protocols, and a strategic reach that no individual component can provide on its own. With stations positioned roughly 20 miles apart, a spacing that modern GIS visibility modeling confirms as geometrically sound for elevated coastal fires, a relay chain could carry a warning signal across 50 miles of coastline or open water in a matter of minutes. No messenger on foot or horseback, and certainly no ship under oar, could come close to that speed across the same distance. The value was not in any single extraordinary fire. It was in the network effect, in the multiplication of reach that only connected relays could achieve. This is what allows us to call it, without anachronism or overstatement, Europe's earliest long-distance telecommunications grid. The word telecommunications simply means the transmission of information over distance. The phryctoria did exactly that, deliberately, systematically, and at a scale that spanned the Aegean world. What it lacked in bandwidth, in the number of distinct messages it could carry, it compensated for in speed and geographic reach. The same trade-off would appear again and again in communication systems built 2,000 years later. The optical telegraph networks of Napoleonic Europe, running semaphore arms from tower to tower across France, faced identical constraints. They could relay a signal from Paris to the Mediterranean coast in minutes, but the vocabulary of signals remained limited by the coding system in use. The principle was identical to the phryctoria, only the mechanics differed. 3 distinct categories of activity benefited from the network, and each tells us something different about why the system was maintained and extended rather than abandoned as a curiosity. Military mobilization was the most obvious application and almost certainly the original driver. When a hostile fleet was sighted rounding a headland, the time between that sighting and the arrival of enemy ships at the next defended harbour could be measured in hours. A coastal runner delivering the same warning might arrive days later, or not at all if the messenger's path ran through territory the enemy already controlled. The beacon relay collapsed that gap dramatically. Commanders who received a fire signal in the evening could have troops standing to at dawn. They could order galleys launched and provisioned before the threat was visible from their own coast. They had options that would have been unavailable without the warning, and military decisions of that kind, whether to fight, withdraw, reinforce, or negotiate, depended entirely on how much lead time the defender possessed. Speed of warning changed decisions even when the message itself said nothing more than enemy ships are coming. That was often enough. Coastal defence was a related but distinct function. Harbours, anchorages, and fortified positions along the Greek coast were not uniformly garrisoned. Maintaining a full military presence everywhere was economically and logistically impossible. What the beacon network provided was a rational alternative: light garrison elsewhere, concentrate strength where it could respond to multiple threats, and depend on the relay chain to direct that response toward wherever the signal originated. This is essentially the logic of a rapid reaction force supported by real-time intelligence, and the phryctoria made it viable for coastal defence in a way that had not been possible before. Less documented but equally plausible is the commercial dimension. Merchant sailors, making decisions about when to depart, which route to take, and whether a particular harbour was currently safe to approach, would have had obvious reasons to pay close attention to beacon activity along their intended course. A fire burning where no fire normally burned was meaningful information even without a codebook. The network's existence created a shared situational awareness across the Greek maritime world, a kind of ambient intelligence that informed not just military commanders, but anyone moving goods or people through the Aegean. The information environment that surrounded Greek commerce was not simply the result of individual merchants carrying news from port to port. The beacon chains were a structural feature of that environment, broadcasting signals that could be read by anyone with line of sight and the knowledge of what to look for. The progression from simple fire signals toward the pyrseia coding system developed by Cleoxenes and Democritus in the 2nd century BC reveals something important about how the network's users understood its limitations. The early system's constraint was not speed or range. Both of those were already impressive by ancient standards. The constraint was expressive capacity. A single fire could say yes or no, danger or safety, come or stay away. A network capable of transmitting any letter of the Greek alphabet, which is what the torch and column coding system achieved, was a network capable of transmitting names, numbers, quantities, and instructions. The engineers who developed that system were not inventing optical telegraphy from scratch. They were expanding the vocabulary of a grid that already existed, recognizing that the infrastructure was sound and that what it needed was a richer language. The Byzantine beacon system that would come centuries later, stretching some 720 kilometers with stations spaced approximately 60 miles apart, demonstrated that the relay concept was durable enough to be worth rebuilding and refining across historical discontinuities. Byzantine engineers reportedly achieved full line transmission in roughly an hour, a figure that when set against the distances involved represents a performance that horse-mounted couriers could not have matched in days. That the Byzantines turned to the same basic architecture the Greeks had used, independently or as conscious heirs to the tradition, confirms that the phryctoria was not an accident or a local improvisation. It was a solution to a permanent strategic problem, and it remained the best available solution for optical long-distance communication until electrical telegraphy arrived in the 19th century. The Greek beacon network, in that full context, looks less like an antiquarian curiosity and more like the first successful implementation of a communications principle that human societies would keep rediscovering precisely because the underlying logic is sound. Relay stations, elevated positions, agreed signals, coordinated observers. The network's value flowing not from the brilliance of any single node, but from the connections between them, and from the speed at which those connections could carry information that arrived too late to act upon was information that might as well not have arrived at all. About 5 centuries after the last classical Greek beacon chains fell silent, a different empire confronted the same fundamental problem. How do you move critical military intelligence faster than any horse or ship can carry it? The Byzantines, governing a sprawling and perpetually threatened domain from Constantinople, arrived at an answer that would have been immediately recognizable to any Athenian signals officer from the age of Themistocles. They built a fire beacon relay line. The system they constructed in the 9th century stretched roughly 720 kilometers from the Cilician Gates, the mountain passes that served as the invasion corridor from the east, northwest across Anatolia, all the way to Constantinople. Contemporary Byzantine sources, including Constantine Porphyrogenitus and the chroniclers Theophanes Continuatus and Simeon Magister, describe it as a coordinated chain of bonfires lit at predetermined hours, timed and synchronized by water clocks, so that each station knew exactly when to watch for the signal from the previous one. According to those accounts, a message could travel the entire length of the chain in approximately 1 hour. For a route spanning what would today take a modern traveller several hours by car, that is a genuinely striking claim, and one that requires us to take seriously what fire-based relay networks could actually achieve in favourable terrain. What makes the Byzantine system particularly useful as a point of comparison is its station spacing. On the open central Anatolian plateau, where flat terrain and clear sight lines gave the engineers maximum flexibility, stations were placed approximately 97 kilometers, roughly 60 miles apart. In the more rugged Bithynian highlands to the northwest, where ridge lines and valleys interrupted long-distance visibility, the intervals dropped to around 56 kilometers. The variation is itself informative. Byzantine planners were optimizing around terrain rather than following a fixed doctrine, which means that the 60-mile spacing in open country was not an arbitrary number, but a ceiling, the farthest distance at which reliable visual contact between elevated stations could be achieved under the atmospheric conditions of the eastern Mediterranean. That figure of 60 miles between Byzantine stations is worth sitting with for a moment. It is 3 times the roughly 20-mile spacing that characterized the classical Greek phryctoria. This does not mean the Byzantines were using dramatically superior technology. Fire is fire. What it suggests is that they were selecting sites with extraordinary care, hilltops and ridgelines that maximized elevation and minimized obstructions, and that on genuinely open terrain with favorable atmospheric conditions, fire-based optical telegraphy could reach considerably farther than the more conservative Greek spacing might imply. The Greek network's 20-mile intervals likely reflect a deliberate emphasis on reliability and redundancy over maximum possible range, a reasonable engineering choice for a system that needed to function across the highly variable coastal topography of the Aegean, where headlands, islands, and sea fog could degrade visibility unpredictably. The continuity of strategic logic here is impossible to ignore. Both cultures faced the same challenge, projecting military awareness over distances that dwarfed any human messenger, and both independently or inheritedly reached the same architectural solution: elevated stations, line-of-sight placement, pre-agreed signals, and trained observers whose entire function was to watch and relay. The Eastern Mediterranean is a consistent environment in certain respects, with its clear summer skies and its tendency to concentrate political violence along predictable corridors. It is perhaps less surprising than it first appears that the same environment kept generating the same communications technology across 8 centuries. But this is precisely where intellectual care becomes essential. The Byzantine evidence is genuinely valuable for thinking about earlier Greek systems, and just as genuinely limited in what it can prove. 800 years and enormous political, institutional, and technological changes separate the 9th century Byzantine chain from the classical phryctoria. The Byzantine system was coordinated with water clocks, a level of timekeeping infrastructure that the earlier Greeks had not deployed in this context. Byzantine stations were identified and maintained by imperial administrative apparatus. The chroniclers who described it were writing for specific political purposes, sometimes with a tendency toward the celebratory. Archaeological identification of many Byzantine stations remains incomplete, and the claimed 1-hour transmission speed, while not physically impossible, rests on ancient accounts that scholars treat with caution rather than credulity. None of that invalidates the comparison. It simply defines its proper scope. When we observe that Byzantine engineers, working with full knowledge of regional terrain and without any electrical or mechanical alternatives available to them, found that elevated fire beacon relays, spaced up to 60 miles apart, could serve as effective strategic communications infrastructure, that observation strengthens the case that earlier Greek networks operating across similar terrain were also capable of sustained, reliable, long-range performance. The plausibility of the phryctoria's most ambitious capabilities, including the 50-mile effective range suggested by modern visibility modelling, gained support from the fact that a later civilization in the same region kept arriving at analogous solutions with similar operational results. What the Byzantine evidence cannot do is fill the specific evidentiary gaps in the Greek record. It cannot tell us precisely how Greek beacon operators calibrated their intervals, what backup procedures they used when weather degraded visibility, or how consistently the network functioned across seasons and political upheavals. The absence of direct archaeological proof for classical Greek station spacing means that even well-documented Byzantine performance cannot be retroactively assigned to the earlier system as established fact. The comparison illuminates a range of the possible. It does not collapse the centuries between the two systems or erase the very real differences in the administrative and technological context in which they operated. What the Byzantine record does most powerfully, then, is confirm that the Eastern Mediterranean held something that made fire-based relay networks persistently worth building, terrain that rewarded elevation, political structures that depended on rapid military intelligence, and distances between threatened frontiers and defended capitals that consistently exceeded the speed of any land-based messenger. The Greek world that constructed the phryctoria was not stumbling onto an eccentric local solution. It was making an intelligent and durable response to a set of geographic and strategic conditions that would continue generating the same response for the better part of a millennium. There is something almost vertiginous about tracing that arc. The emperor in Constantinople receiving word of a threat from the Cilician gates via a chain of hilltop fires was, in the most structurally fundamental sense, doing what Greek coastal commanders had done when beacon fires from Sciathus raced south ahead of the Persian fleet. The specific signals differed, the political stakes differed, the sophistication of the coordinating infrastructure differed, but the core act, converting a distant observation into light, relaying that light from height to height, and collapsing geographic distance into something close to real time, was the same act, rooted in the same permanent logic of elevated terrain, atmospheric clarity, and human vigilance. Byzantine evidence does not prove Greek capability, but it does something nearly as valuable. It demonstrates that the capability was real, that it was worth the considerable effort of constructing and maintaining it, and that across the long sweep of Mediterranean history, before any alternative existed, fire on a hilltop remained the fastest way a threatened civilization could speak across the dark. So where does all of this leave us exactly? We have ancient literary accounts, engineering logic reconstructed from archaeology, modern computational modelling of visibility across Mediterranean terrain, and a compelling Byzantine parallel stretching nearly a millennium forward. These are four genuinely different kinds of evidence, and they do not all speak with equal confidence. Part of understanding what the phryctoria actually achieved requires being honest about which conclusions rest on solid ground and which rest on inference, sophisticated, well-reasoned inference, but inference nonetheless. Start with what the evidence handles well. The existence of beacon systems used for naval alerts is not seriously in dispute among historians of the ancient world. Herodotus places fire signals at Sciathus in a specific narrative context, the warning of the Persian fleet's approach before Artemisium, with the kind of incidental, matter-of-fact detail that characterizes genuine historical memory rather than literary invention. Thucydides, writing with even more forensic care, records the Corcyra beacon relaying intelligence about 60 Athenian ships. Neither author is explaining or defending the technology. They are simply reporting that it was used, the way you might mention that a messenger rode north. That unself-conscious casualness is significant. It suggests that beacon communication was sufficiently familiar to their audiences, that no elaboration was required, which in turn implies a well-established and widely understood system rather than an experimental or unusual one. Tower spacing is similarly well supported by the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence. Ancient engineering texts and their descriptions of sighting criteria, the physical logic of line-of-sight transmission across documented Aegean geography, and the consistent archaeological identification of elevated structures at intervals corresponding to roughly 20 miles. All of these point in the same direction without being derived from one another. When independent evidence types agree, historians weight that agreement heavily. The roughly 20-mile interval between stations is probably the single most reliable technical fact about the classical Greek system. The existence of a coded torch method, the pyrseia developed by Cleoxenes and Democritus in the 2nd century BC, is documented in Polybius directly. It is not a reconstruction or a model. Polybius describes the mechanics with enough specificity that the system can be reconstructed, worked through, and verified as internally coherent. The torch and alphabet grid that assigns each Greek letter a row and column position, transmitted by torch groups held aloft in sequence, is a genuinely documented piece of ancient communication engineering. Whether it was used routinely, whether it was widely adopted beyond specific military contexts, whether it ever transmitted long messages in adverse conditions, those questions are less clear, but its existence and its design are established. Now consider where the evidence becomes thinner. The question of maximum sea range is where modern enthusiasm most risks outrunning ancient reality. The figure of approximately 50 miles, the one that gives this subject much of its drama, comes primarily from modern GIS and viewshed modelling, which calculates the theoretical visibility of a fire on an elevated tower under clear atmospheric conditions. Those models are not guesswork. They use genuine physics, known atmospheric transmission coefficients, real terrain elevation data, and established thresholds for the minimum fire intensity visible to the adapted human eye at various distances. The modelling is legitimate science applied carefully to a historical question, but the models produce upper bounds. They describe what is possible when conditions cooperate, when the air is dry and clear, when the observer's eye is well adapted to darkness, when the fire is large and well maintained, when there is no haze off the water. The Eastern Mediterranean in summer can offer all of those conditions simultaneously. It can also deliver sea fog at dawn, haze during the afternoon Etesian winds, and irregular atmospheric refraction that unpredictably bends or breaks the sight line between two elevated points. Ancient sources give us no systematic data on the frequency with which those conditions degraded or disrupted beacon communication. We have no ancient equivalent of an operational log recording nights when signals were missed, fires failed to be seen, or messages had to wait for morning. The 50-mile figure describes a ceiling, not a routine. The honest assessment is that operational range under typical conditions was probably shorter, perhaps significantly shorter on the worst days, and we have no way to quantify how often worst days arrived. Transmission speed for complex messages carries similar uncertainty in the opposite direction from the dramatic. The pyrseia could in principle encode any Greek letter. A sequence of letters could in principle spell any word. But spelling a word using torch signals visible at 20 or more miles in a sequence requiring the receiver to count torches raised and held in specific positions, then coordinate that count with a tablet or memorized grid, then record the letter and await the next sequence, that is a slow and cognitively demanding process, even in ideal conditions. In poor light, rough sea conditions interfering with torch visibility, or wind affecting the flame's coherence and directional readability, the process would become dramatically slower and more error-prone. The later Byzantine system, with its far simpler binary signals and water clock coordination, was faster precisely because it made fewer demands of the individual observer. The Greek alphabetic system may have represented a theoretical advance in information density, without achieving comparable practical throughput in real operational conditions. This is a recognized methodological challenge for historians evaluating systems that are partly documented and partly reconstructed. The approach that most scholars use is to triangulate between what texts directly attest, what physical logic permits, and what analogous systems in similar environments actually achieve. Each of those three inputs has a different kind of authority. Texts are specific but selective, often written for purposes other than technical documentation. Physical models are rigorous but ideal rather than empirical. Analogies from similar systems, the Byzantine beacon lines for example, are genuinely informative but separated by enough time and institutional difference that they cannot simply be transferred to the earlier case. The result of that triangulation, done honestly, is not a clean verdict. It is a range of confidence that varies with the question being asked. Was there a functional beacon network used for naval alerts? Yes, with high confidence. Were stations spaced at roughly 20-mile intervals and sighted for line of sight? Yes, with substantial confidence. Could a large fire on an elevated tower in ideal conditions be seen at distances approaching 50 miles? Physically, yes. Did it routinely achieve that range in operational use? Uncertain could the pyrseia transmit complex alphabetic messages. In principle, yes. How quickly, how reliably, across what range of weather conditions? Unknown. What makes this kind of evidentiary honesty worth doing, rather than simply committing to the most exciting interpretation, is that the phryctoria's genuine achievements are impressive enough to carry the argument without inflation. A system that demonstrably alerted Greek fleets to Persian movements, demonstrably coordinated naval responses across island chains and open straits, and demonstrably developed into coded alphabetic transmission, is already a remarkable chapter in the history of human communication. The honest version of that story, with its acknowledged uncertainties, is more durable than a maximalist account that will eventually be qualified by the next round of careful scholarship. The ancient Greeks built something real. How far exactly it reached, and how reliably it performed across every condition the Aegean could throw at it, those questions deserve open answers. And open answers, it turns out, are more interesting than false precision. So step back from the uncertainties and hold the whole picture at once. What the phryctoria actually represents, even in its most cautious evidence-constrained form, is something that deserves to be stated clearly. The ancient Greeks changed the meaning of distance. Before this system existed, distance was experienced in units of travel time. The space between an island lookout and a fleet commander was measured in hours. How long it took a rowing vessel to cross open water, how long a messenger on horseback could cover rough Aegean coastal terrain before exhaustion. Information moved at the speed of the body carrying it. That was true everywhere in the ancient world, and it had been true since the beginning of recorded history. The fundamental constraint on military coordination, on commerce, on political decision-making, was the physical speed of a human being in motion. The beacon network broke that constraint. Not completely, not under all conditions, not for complex messages in the early phases of the system's development, but it broke it in ways that were strategically decisive. A Persian fleet spotted rounding a headland at dawn could become an alert at a harbour 50 miles away before that same fleet had travelled 10 miles further down the coast. The information arrived before the threat. That is a structural transformation in how power operated across geographic space, and it happened using nothing more sophisticated than fire, stone towers, and organized human attention. What makes this more than a clever military trick is the infrastructure required to sustain it. The network was not spontaneous. It demanded towers built at calculated intervals across a landscape chosen specifically for line-of-sight transmission. It required trained observers, the phryctories, stationed at elevated posts, maintaining readiness across long watches during which nothing might happen, but during which anything might happen, and the response time had to be measured in minutes rather than hours. It required regular supplies of dry firewood, because a beacon that cannot be lit in under 3 minutes is not a beacon at all. It required codified procedures so that observers at one station knew exactly what a given signal from the previous station meant, and exactly what they needed to transmit forward, and it required that the whole chain of stations be understood, maintained, and funded as a single coordinated system, rather than a collection of independent fires. That organizational achievement is in many ways more impressive than the optics. Modern visibility modeling can confirm that a large fire on a 40-meter tower can project light across 20 or 30 kilometers of clear Mediterranean air. The physics was never the hard part. The hard part was building the social and logistical machinery that turned that physical fact into reliable, repeatable state-level communication. Territory had to be organized around the network's requirements. Labor had to be directed toward its maintenance. Codes had to be designed, agreed upon, and remembered. This is precisely what distinguishes a telecommunications infrastructure from a single torch waved in the night. And the trajectory of the system's development tells its own story about where this was heading. The earliest beacons carried blunt, pre-arranged meanings: danger approaching, fleet spotted, attack imminent. Those were powerful messages, but they were limited ones. The move toward the pyrseia, toward Cleoxenes and Democritus, encoding the Greek alphabet into 2 groups of torches held aloft in sequence, toward a system where any word could theoretically be spelled across miles of open sea, represents something that historians of technology recognize as a fundamental conceptual leap. It is the move from signal to language, from physical gesture to abstract code. That is exactly the same conceptual leap that would be taken again, nearly 2,000 years later, when Samuel Morse reduced language to dots and dashes, When Claude Chappe built his optical telegraph across France, with mechanical arms encoding letters through position, when the first electrical telegraphs carried text across continents by modulating current rather than light. In every case, the core innovation is abstraction, the recognition that meaning does not require the physical presence of the thing being described, only an agreed-upon symbol that stands in for it. The pyrseia arrived at that recognition with torches and tablet grids in the 2nd century BC, the intellectual genealogy running from Cleoxenes and Democritus through Polybius's description of their system forward to the semaphore towers of Napoleonic Europe is not metaphorical. It is a real lineage in the history of how human beings learned to separate information from its physical carrier. The Byzantine beacon system, stretching across Anatolia, with stations separated by roughly 60 miles in the 9th century AD, shows that this understanding did not die with classical Greece. The Byzantines recognized optical relay networks as strategic infrastructure worth building and maintaining at state expense, placing their stations on the same elevated coastal terrain, using the same fundamental principle of line-of-sight relay. The interval was longer, 60 miles rather than 20, partly because Byzantine signal technology had simplified to a binary yes or no message, synchronized with water clocks, which required less precision from the individual observer. But the concept, the recognition that you could organize space into a communication grid using fire and elevated position, was continuous. It had survived, adapted, and been institutionalized again. That continuity matters for how we place the phryctoria in the larger story of communications history. It is tempting to treat ancient signal systems as precursors, interesting forerunners of the real thing, the thing that arrived with electrical telegraphy in the 19th century. That framing misses what the beacon network actually was. It was not a precursor to telecommunications, it was telecommunications operating through a different physical medium. It had relay architecture, it had coded abstraction of language, it had state-level infrastructure organized around the goal of moving information faster than a human body could travel. The absence of electricity did not make it less conceptually sophisticated. It made it harder to build and harder to maintain, which is precisely why the organizational achievement around it is so worth recognizing. This brings the entire story back to the question that started it, the question of whether ships could really communicate across 50 miles of open ocean. After everything, the tower placements, the coded torch systems, the real-world case studies at Sciathus and Corcyra, the modern visibility models, the Byzantine parallel, and the honest accounting of where the evidence holds and where it thins, the question turns out to have been pointing at something deeper than a distance measurement all along. The 50 miles was never really the point. The point was the system. Because crossing 50 miles of water with a message is a physical problem that depends on height, fire, and atmospheric clarity. But building something that could reliably, repeatedly, strategically project organized meaning across that space, that is a different kind of problem entirely. It is the problem that every communications engineer since has faced in some form, and the ancient Greeks, working with hilltops and torchwood and codified signals, solved a version of it that remained essentially unsurpassed until the wire changed everything. So here is the final judgment, stated plainly. The ancient Greek beacon system was real, it was sophisticated, and it worked. Not without limits, not across unlimited distances or for unlimited message types. But within its actual operating parameters, it constituted a functional long-distance communication network that shaped military outcomes, altered the strategic balance between fleets, and demonstrated a conceptual grasp of coded information transmission that would not be systematically surpassed for nearly 2 millennia. The standard operational range was 20 miles between towers, roughly 30 kilometers, chosen not arbitrarily, but through practical experience with what a large fire on an elevated platform could reliably project across Mediterranean air. Modern visibility modeling confirms the physics behind that choice. A modest fire on a 40-meter tower reaches approximately 26 miles under clear conditions. Exceptional topography, taller elevations and favourable atmospheric transparency could push that figure toward 50 miles, which is where the upper bound figure comes from, not from any ancient surveyor's measurement, but from the geometry of what is actually possible when fire, height and clear sea air combine at their best. The 50-mile number is an outer edge, not a routine guarantee. The 20-mile relay spacing was the standard because it was reliable. Consistency mattered more than maximum theoretical range, and the network was engineered around what could be counted on rather than what might occur on a perfect night in a perfect season. What gives the system historical weight beyond engineering estimates is the evidence that it was actually used. The Herodotus account of Sciathus and the Thucydides account at Corcyra are not decorative citations. They are the closest thing we have to ground-level documentation that the beacon network functioned as naval signalling infrastructure during periods of genuine strategic crisis. At Sciathus, fire warnings gave the Greek fleet advance notice of the Persian approach, information that no rowing vessel could have delivered with comparable speed. At Corcyra, 60 approaching Athenian ships were signalled into an alert before their arrival completed the journey in physical form. In both cases, the chain between observation and response was compressed dramatically. What those cases prove is not the maximum range of any single beacon fire, but something more important, that organised parties trusted the system enough to act on it, and that the system delivered. That trust was earned incrementally through the development of something more than fire. The earliest beacons communicated blunt, prearranged signals: danger, arrival, threat approaching. Those signals were powerful precisely because they were unambiguous, but they were bounded by whatever the two parties had agreed to in advance. The move toward the pyrseia changed the nature of what was possible. When Cleoxenes and Democritus designed their torch and alphabet system in the 2nd century BC, two groups of torches encoding row and column positions against a grid of the Greek alphabet, they were not merely improving the technology, they were crossing a conceptual threshold. A network that can send any letter can, in principle, send any word. A network that can send any word is no longer a signalling system with a fixed vocabulary. It is a telecommunications medium in the full sense of the term. That distinction is what elevates the pyrseia from a clever engineering solution to something historically significant. The Greeks had arrived through practical iteration, at the insight that meaning could be detached from a physical carrier and encoded in abstract positional symbols, then reassembled by a trained receiver at the other end. The fire was not the message, the pattern of fires was the message, and the pattern could encode anything that could be written. That is the foundational logic of every coded communication system that followed, whether the mechanism was torches, semaphore arms, dots and dashes, or binary electrical pulses. The legacy encoded in that step extended forward through time visibly enough that the Byzantines working in the 9th century AD maintained beacon relay lines with station intervals of approximately 60 miles across open Anatolian terrain, longer gaps than the Greek standard, because their message format was simplified enough to tolerate greater distance, but the same infrastructure logic: elevated positions, line-of-sight relay, state-level organization around the requirement of moving information faster than a messenger on foot or a crew at oars. None of this should be overstated. The early Greek beacon system had a narrow message vocabulary. The pyrseia may not have been in widespread use during the Herodotus and Thucydides episodes. Evidence for the precise mechanics of individual relay stations is fragmentary at best. The honest version of this history holds all of that clearly in view, but honest assessment does not require minimizing what the evidence does support. What it supports is a network that reduced the strategic consequences of geographic distance, that made it possible for a warning to outpace the threat it described, and that gestured with remarkable clarity toward the principle that would eventually produce the telegraph. Picture the Aegean on a clear autumn night. A single fire ignites on a rocky promontory above the water, then another on an island peak 12 miles to the south, then another and another, each flame calling the next into being across the island chain. A message travelling faster than any trireme, faster than any wind-filled sail, crossing the dark water in minutes where any human carrier would need hours. The light moved, and somewhere at the far end of the chain a harbour commander understood what it meant and gave an order. That is what those fires achieved.